Welcome and thank you for joining us to learn about the updates to the 4th edition of the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework. My name is Julie Dorsey and I'm the chair of the Commission on Practice. I'm joined by current members of the Commission on Practice for this presentation: Shelley Coleman-Casto, Charlotte Davis, Liz Griffin-Lanigan, Elizabeth Metzger, Julie Miller, Amy Owens, Krista Rives, Caitlin Seinovec, Wayne Winnesdorfer, and AOTA Staff Liaison Deborah Lieberman. We also want to acknowledge the past members of the COP who made significant contributions to the framework: Cheryl Boop, Susan Cahill, Barlisha Gibbs, Brian Herr, and Kim Kearney. This slide outlines the main learning objectives for this session, which are to describe the major changes to the OTPF4 and discuss the implications for practice, education, research, and advocacy, and to apply the OTPF4 to practice with a focus on supporting and advancing the profession. We'll start with a brief overview of the COP and the revision process that led to the 4th edition. We'll spend the majority of the time discussing each of the main areas of the framework with an emphasis on describing the major updates in each section. The Commission on Practice is a body of the Representative Assembly of AOTA. The main purpose of the COP is to support and advance practice through a variety of methods and activities. The COP analyzes trends in systems and programs that affect the delivery of OT services, solicits input from other volunteer sector groups regarding current issues and concerns in OT practice, and serves as a resource on issues related to practice. Much of the COP's work is overseeing the AOTA official documents related to OT practice. All official documents are reviewed every 5 years by the Commission. Members of the COP conduct an initial review to determine the most appropriate level of revision for that document. Depending on the document, it's then revised either by COP members or by outside authors. Content experts, AOTA members, and volunteer bodies, as well as AOTA policy staff, provide input into the review process at various stages, and this varies slightly by document. The document is then either approved by the Representative Assembly Coordinating Committee if it underwent relatively minor changes, or by the full Representative Assembly if it underwent major changes or is a new document. Official documents are disseminated through the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, the Reference Manual of Official Documents, and the AOTA website. This slide shows where official documents are located on the AOTA website, and the highlighted document is the OTPF4 under the Guidelines section. Next, we'll move into talking specifically about one official document, the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework. The framework was first published in 2002, and it's undergone 4 revisions during the standard 5-year review cycle. This slide summarizes some of the major changes that occurred in each of the prior 2 revisions. Each edition of the framework also includes a summary of the major changes in that edition in the preface, so you can see full details right in the document. In 2018, the COP once again began the process of updating the framework. This process started with an initial member feedback survey to get input on the 3rd edition and suggestions for needed edits and additions. The COP then held various listening sessions with stakeholder groups to gather additional member feedback. All feedback was synthesized, and the Commission met at AOTA headquarters to begin to draft the revisions to the OTPF3. This process took place over many months and was still underway during the 2019 AOTA conference. The COP presented a session at that conference to update attendees on the proposed changes and solicit further input. That feedback was later incorporated into the document. The COP met again at AOTA headquarters in June 2019 for an intensive work session. The draft of the OTPF4 was finalized in the summer of 2019 and was sent to copy editing for their review. Once copy edited, the OTPF4 was shared with members for their review and feedback. These survey results were incorporated into the final version of the OTPF4 that was included in the COP's spring report to the Representative Assembly. Members were asked to submit feedback on the final draft through the RA Motions Feedback Survey. The RA discussed the framework and voted to approve the document with a few edits in May 2020. The pre-publication manuscript was published on AOTA's website in June 2020, and the manuscript for AJOT is being typeset as we speak. Approximately 1,000 AOTA members gave input over almost 2 years during this review process. If you were one of them, we thank you for your valuable input, and it really did guide our work and strengthen the document. So what changed? Let's take a deeper look into the OTPF4 now. It's important to note that a summary of the major changes is included in the preface of the OTPF4 in an easy-to-read bulleted list. We'll go through each of the sections now, but know that you can always quickly refer to the bulleted list in the preface when you're working with the actual document. Before we get started, I wanted to emphasize an important point. While this isn't different in the 4th edition, it's really important for listeners to recognize that when we refer to occupational therapy practitioners, we are including both occupational therapists and occupational therapy assistants. This is noted in the document itself, and it's important that we all recognize and use this inclusive term. One major change in the OTPF4 is the addition of the cornerstones of occupational therapy practice. The transactional relationship between the domain and the process is facilitated by the OT practitioner. OT practitioners have distinct knowledge, skills, and qualities that contribute to the success of the OT process, and those are described in this document as the cornerstones. A cornerstone is defined as something of great importance on which everything else depends. The following cornerstones of occupational therapy help to distinguish us from other professions: core values and beliefs rooted in occupation, knowledge and expertise in the therapeutic use of occupation, professional behaviors and dispositions, and therapeutic use of self. These cornerstones are not hierarchical, but rather each concept influences the other. Practitioners develop cornerstones over time through education, mentorship, and experience. There are many contributors that influence each cornerstone. Like the cornerstones, these contributors are complementary and they interact to provide a foundation for practitioners. This slide includes some of the possible contributors that influence the cornerstones. I'm now going to turn it over to Liz Lanigan, who will discuss the clients of occupational therapy.
Thanks, Julie. In OTPF4, clients are defined as persons, group, or population. As such, information about the client's wants, needs, strengths, context, limitations, and occupational risks is gathered and synthesized and framed from an occupational perspective. People may also consider themselves part of a community, such as the deaf community or the disability community. A community is a collection of populations that is changeable and diverse and includes various people, groups, networks, and organizations. It is important to consider the community or communities with which a client identifies throughout the occupational therapy process. We recognize that the tables in this presentation are difficult to read. Please refer to the full tables in OTPF4 for details. This view of tables is an attempt to generally orient you to the revised tables. This portion of Table 1 illustrates the inclusion of person, group, and population examples that are provided throughout OTPF4. Figure 1 represents aspects of the domain and process and the overarching goal of the profession of achieving health, well-being, and participation in life through engagement and occupation. Although the figure illustrates these two elements in distinct places, in reality, the domain and process interact in complex and dynamic ways as described throughout OTPF4. The nature of these interactions is impossible to capture in a static, one-dimensional image. So the simplified figure gives a visual representation of all aspects of the domain and process. Next, Liz Metzger will discuss the first part of the domain section, which is occupation.
Thanks, Liz. So the major change to the occupation section was the addition of health management as an occupation category. This update was based on feedback from AOTA members that felt it was increasingly more important to focus on occupational therapy practitioners addressing health management to maintain and improve performance in other categories. For example, if you are unable to manage pre-existing conditions like diabetes or congestive heart failure, participating in work, leisure, and social participation will be impacted. The area of health management is also an important recognition that occupational therapy services are a strong component of keeping people out of hospitals and actively participating in the community. Based upon member feedback, more examples of technology have been added as it relates to education and e-learning, and IEDLs like the use of phone apps for managing finances and social participation and the use of social media. There was feedback expressed by membership about distinguishing play and leisure, so those definitions were refined to reflect that distinction. Additionally, there has been long-standing questions about how to clearly delineate occupation and activity throughout the framework. The distinction between the two has been clarified to encourage occupation-based focus and intervention. In order to address concerns about the OTPF being used globally and being more accessible to international audiences, more attention was given to the concept of co-occupations and the concept of interdependency. Finally, membership has been asking for more clarity on how occupational therapy practitioners intervene on a person, group, and population level. Examples were provided for occupations at both the person and group level, and clarification was provided regarding population level. On the next slide, you can see the updated occupations table with examples taken from the new health management section. As described in Table 2, there are many examples of health management occupations that occupational therapy practitioners can address. Finally, here you can see the new table with examples of occupations that occur on a person and group level. Next, Wayne will discuss the updates to the context section.
And thank you, Liz. I want to start this section by pointing out that the previous version of the OT practice framework included environment and context as two distinct components. In updating to the OT practice framework 4, we utilized the World Health Organization's International Classification of Functioning to examine the totality of the world around us. According to ICF, context includes environment. That's what I'll walk you through now. Context is a broad construct based or defined as the environmental and personal factors specific to each client and they influence engagement and participation in occupations. Context affects clients' access to occupations and the quality of and satisfaction with their performance. Practitioners recognize that for people to truly achieve full participation, meaning, and purpose, they must not only function, but also engage comfortably within their own distinct combination of context. In the literature, the terms environment and context often are used interchangeably, but this may result in confusion when describing aspects of situations in which occupational engagement actually takes place. Understanding the context in which occupations can and do occur provides practitioners with insights into the overarching, underlying, and embedded influence of environmental factors and personal factors on engagement in occupations. Another update that I'll call to your attention to the OT Practice Framework 4 is that temporal context as it existed in OTPF3 has been moved to client and I just lost my place. Has been moved to client factors due to feedback from members about the difficulty of understanding and the application of temporal context. You'll see that temporal aspects when we get to the client factors section of this presentation. So, environmental factors, let me go to the next slide. Environmental factors are aspects of the physical, social, and attitudinal surroundings in which people live and conduct their lives. Environmental factors influence functioning and disability and have positive aspects or facilitators, or they could have negative aspects, such as barriers or hindrances. Environmental factors are organized into 5 categories consistent with the ICF. This slide contains an excerpt of Table 4, and the full table includes all 5 classifications of environmental factors: natural environment, products and technology, support and relationships, attitudes, and services, systems, and policies. The components column on this slide is just one example within each of the larger categories of the 5 environmental factors. And the examples columns on this slide is a specific explanation and application to practice and everyday life that illustrates the specific components. There are multiple components related to each of the environmental factors listed here, and each of the components is explained or clarified by a number of examples. So when people interact with the world around them, environmental factors can either enable or restrict participation in meaningful occupations. Addressing the barriers, such as widening a doorway to allow access, results in environmental supports that enable participation. A client who has difficulty performing effectively in one context may be successful when the natural environment has human-made modifications, or if the client uses applicable products and technology. On the next slide, personal factors are the unique features of a person that are not part of a health condition or health state, and they constitute the particular background of a person's life and living. Personal factors are internal influences affecting functioning and disability and are not considered either positive or negative. They reflect the essence of the person, who we are. When clients provide demographic information to an occupational therapy practitioner, the client is typically describing their personal factors. And personal factors can include customs, beliefs, activity patterns, behavioral standards, expectations accepted by society or cultural groups. Personal factors are generally considered to be enduring, stable attributes of the person, although some personal factors may change over time. And the personal factors are categorized as age, sexual orientation, gender identity, race and ethnicity, cultural identification and cultural attitudes, social background, social status, socioeconomic status, upbringing and life experience, habits, past, current behavioral patterns, education, profession, professional identity, and lifestyle. In the OTPF, we provide some examples of how persons may vary based on their own individual personal factors. In summary, context is the domain that covers environmental factors and personal factors, and are an important aspect of occupational therapy assessment, intervention planning, and implementation of services. The next member of the Commission on Practice who contributed to this presentation is Julie Miller, and she will discuss performance patterns.
Thank you, Wayne. Performance patterns are the acquired habits, routines, roles, and rituals used in the process of engaging consistently in occupations that can support or hinder occupational performance. These patterns help to establish lifestyle and daily routines. They help support occupational balance in an individual's day and are shaped by context such as cultural norms, social calendars, and work hours. For example, if we think about our current experience, we can see how many of our routines have shifted since this past March. Simple steps like our commute to work or our daily stop to coffee has adjusted, and we might have a change in work location, hours, or supporting children before school, which now all occur at home. This practice framework also encourages a wider understanding of daily habits. Habits refer to specific behaviors. They may be automatic, adaptive, or maladaptive behaviors. They may be healthy or unhealthy, such as taking rest breaks from our screen time or working on screen activities for hours at a time. Efficient or inefficient, and supportive or harmful, such as setting an alarm clock before going to bed or not setting an alarm clock and dealing with the consequences. An activity may be habitual, but not necessarily supportive of a person's overall day. In this revision of the practice framework, there's also a greater emphasis on occupational balance. Occupational balance is the amount of time we spend doing productive, restorative, and leisure occupations. Occupational balance is shaped by context, such as work hours, social calendars, or cultural norms of a person, a group, or a population as a whole. When considering occupational balance, we might ask, how does this person or group spend their time? This is important as we hope to best understand our clients' day, goals, and possibly even our recommendations for frequency of intervention. As we think about time or how someone spends their time, we must consider what may support an individual's actual meaning of time. The understanding of time is impacted by many things, such as biological rhythms, our sleep and wake cycle, our families of origin, our work schedule with the classic 9 to 5, our social schedules, and cyclic cultural patterns. An understanding of the passage of time helps provide structure and rhythm for performance patterns to occur. In this table, in Table 6, we demonstrate first individual examples of performance patterns, clearly defining habits, routines, roles, and rituals that give the reader clear examples for these patterns. For example, a habit might be always setting the home alarm before leaving the house. A routine may be following your common morning sequence to get ready, such as toileting, bathing, hygiene, and dressing. Being the role of a volunteer at a local park, and the ritual of saying the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of the school day. After the individual examples, Table 6 goes on to describe the same performance patterns at the group and population level. Rather than considering a daily routine for one person, we may be thinking about these routines for a group of people, like here, attendees or employees attending a department meeting, or a group setting up for a fitness class. What routines might we notice being different between these two different groups which support or inhibit their occupational performance? Different actions are needed for their success. Next, we can look at these same patterns as we work to apply them to a population as a whole. So here we give the example of routines for all parents of young children, or how all schools in the U.S. follow required procedures. While it was too long to show all of the complete chart here, it continues with a group and population examples of both roles and rituals. I now turn over to Liz Lanigan to address performance skills.
Thanks, Julie. The OTPF4 presents the general approach to performance skills that are addressed across all populations and practice settings. OTs and OTAs apply these general performance skills when analyzing the quality of doing to understand individual clients' strengths and challenges in specific occupational performance, such as motor skills related to school performance or process skills related to ADL performance. For motor, process, and social interaction skills, each has subcategories which include specific individual performance skills for the client. Motor skills focus on person as client. This portion of Table 7 presents a sample of the motor skills subcategory of moving self and objects, with its individual motor skills of moves, lifts, walks, and transports. Within the provided occupational example of completing janitorial tasks at a factory site, there are descriptions of effective and ineffective performance for each motor skill. This performance skill format repeats throughout Table 7 to include a diversity of populations and occupational examples. Process skills focuses on persons or groups as clients. This portion of Table 7 presents the sample process skills subcategory of organizing time, with its individual process skills of initiates, continues, sequence, and terminates. Within the provided occupational example of using an ATM to get cash to pay the babysitter, descriptions of effective and ineffective performance are provided for each of the process skills. Social interaction skills focus on persons or groups as the client. This portion of Table 7 presents the sample social interaction skills subcategory of producing social interaction, with its individual social interaction skills of produces speech, gesticulates, and speaks fluently. Within the provided occupational example of a child playing in a sandbox with others to build roads for cars and trucks, descriptions of effective and ineffective performance are provided for each of the social interaction skills. When applying performance skills to groups, OTs and OTAs need to determine if the group is failing to accomplish its collective outcomes. If so, then individual performance skills will be analyzed for that client or that individual of the group, and individual intervention may be offered towards the goal of assisting the group to meet its collective outcome. This portion of Table 8 presents the group as a religious organization committee furnishing preschool spaces for member families as the collective outcome example. The sample motor skills subcategory of obtaining and holding objects describes ineffective individual motor skills of reaching, bending, gripping, manipulating, and coordinating. Lastly, the table provides the potential impact on others in the group who need to accommodate in order for the group to reach its collective outcomes. Next, Krista will discuss the changes in client factors.
Thanks, Liz. Under the client factors domain, there were several updates made. There's more clarification on client factors versus performance skills, explaining that client factors are specific capacities, characteristics, or beliefs that reside within the person and that influence performance and occupations. Client factors have an impact on performance skills and need to be present in order for a person to successfully perform an occupation. More examples were added to describe this relationship. Language was added to describe how client factors can be understood as relative to groups and populations. Client factors may be used to help define the group or population. Although client factors may be described differently when applied to a group or population, the underlying principles do not change substantively. Client factors of a group or population are explored by performing needs assessments, and interventions might include program development and strategic planning to help the members engage in occupations. Gender identity was added to the category of experience of self and time under mental functions, and interoception was added under sensory functions. Lastly, the definition of psychosocial was expanded to align with the ICF, which now reads, general mental functions as they develop over the lifespan required to understand and constructively integrate the mental functions that lead to formation of the personal and interpersonal skills needed to establish reciprocal social interactions in terms of both meaning and purpose. Here you see the section of Table 9, where the relevant example for experience of self and time now includes gender identity in parentheses. In this section of Table 9, interoception is explained with examples. Next, Shelley will discuss the changes made to the process section.
Thank you, Krista. I'll be taking the next few slides to introduce the occupational therapy process and some of the global changes that were made from the OTPF3 to the OTPF4. The occupational therapy process describes the actions that practitioners take when providing services that are client-centered and focused on engagement in occupations. The process includes evaluation and intervention to achieve desired outcomes. Evaluation, intervention, and outcomes will be discussed in detail later in this presentation. While the OTPF4 describes the occupational therapy process as linear, the reality is that the process does not occur in a sequenced or linear manner. The occupational therapy process is fluid and dynamic and allows practitioners and clients to maintain their focus on desired outcomes while being responsive to any changes that occur throughout the process. One highlighted change from the OTPF3 to the OTPF4 is the section on service delivery approaches. This section further clarifies and defines direct services and indirect services. In the definitions of both direct and indirect service delivery, additional language regarding the occupational therapy process with populations has been added. You will notice as evaluation, intervention, and outcomes are further discussed, this addition of populations is integrated throughout the occupational therapy process. Along with further clarifying service delivery, the content on practice within organizations and systems was moved to the process section of the OTPF4, whereas it was previously found in the preface of the OTPF3. This change further reflects the application of the occupational therapy process within populations. One other important update to discuss is the language surrounding therapeutic use of self. An integral part of the occupational therapy process is therapeutic use of self. An OT practitioner must use therapeutic use of self throughout all aspects of the OT process. As a result, therapeutic use of self has been identified as one of the cornerstones of occupational therapy practice. Occupational therapy practitioners must create an inclusive, supportive environment to enable clients to feel safe in expressing themselves authentically. Building an inclusive environment could include actions such as pursuing education on gender-affirming care, acknowledging systemic issues affecting underrepresented groups, and using a lens of cultural humility throughout the occupational therapy process. Within the OTPF4, occupational analysis versus activity analysis was also more clearly defined. As described earlier in the occupation section of the domain, language has been added to the OTPF4 to delineate occupation and activity. Table 11 highlights the difference between activity and occupation specific to the relevance and importance as depicted on this slide, which this slide captures a section of Table 11. Additionally, as you can see in this table, there are examples of activity demands and occupational demands at the person, group, and population level. And these categories of examples are throughout the full table. Lastly, I wanted to call your attention to Table 10 that delineates in detail the differences in the occupational therapy process between person, group, and populations. The significantly expanded table is essential in supporting practitioners to be able to provide occupational therapy services at the person, group, and population level. Next, Caitlin is going to be covering more in depth the evaluation portion of the occupational therapy process.
Thanks, Shelley. The evaluation process remained relatively the same with revisions. However, updates were made to reflect current practice and to continue to emphasize the importance of occupation throughout the process. Screenings are now included as a potential part of the evaluation process. The synthesis of evaluation section was added to focus on the importance of reviewing assessment and evaluation results and bringing together information obtained from occupational profiles and analyses of occupational performance. Synthesizing the evaluation results builds a framework for practitioners to then develop the intervention plan. Like other sections of the OTPF4, the intervention section was updated to reflect the current and evidence-based practice, including recent initiatives such as choosing wisely. It also encourages practitioners to apply the best available evidence throughout the intervention process. One major change was revising the previous intervention type of preparatory methods to interventions to support occupations and activities. In alignment with choosing wisely and other AOTA documents, it is defined as approaches that should be part of a broader plan. Thus, preparatory methods support and enable occupation, but should not be the sole component of an occupational therapy intervention. Within this section, physical agent and mechanical modalities, also known as PAMs, were updated to reflect current terminology and again reinforces that they are part of a broader intervention. Table 12 provides a visual representation of all types of occupational therapy interventions. Displayed here are the interventions to support occupation, describing the concepts of using this intervention type to enable occupational performance. The table also provides examples of the application of intervention types with persons, groups, and populations as applicable. Additional content revisions include the addition of self-regulation as an intervention within interventions to support occupations, as well as virtual interventions as a type of intervention, which has become very timely given our current circumstances. Finally, another significant change was to clearly differentiate group as an intervention type versus group as a client, which was defined earlier in the OTPF4. Table 12 additionally provides definitions and examples of virtual interventions pictured here, including telehealth for persons, groups, and populations. Finally, Table 12 also defines group interventions and clarifies how group interventions can be applied to person, group, and population as the client. Next, Charlotte will review the changes to the outcome section of the OTPF4.
Thanks, Caitlin. Outcomes describe the results that clients can achieve from occupational therapy intervention. The outcome section of the OTPF4 has been expanded to include discharge, transition, and outcomes to reflect the fluid nature of the human experience as clients move from one life situation to another. For example, a client transitioning from an acute care hospital to a skilled nursing facility, or a child aging out of early intervention and attending preschool. Additionally, planning for discontinuation of OT services begins at the initial evaluation. Goals for the person may include prevention of readmission, and for groups and populations, this may include assessment of the sustainability of programming for long-term success. Discharge planning requires a referral to a provider within occupational therapy with an advanced knowledge or skill, for example, vestibular rehab, or a provider outside of the profession like a psychiatrist. The OTPF4 expands the definition of client to include groups and populations, and examples of outcomes for each type of client are illustrated in the following slide. Table 14 delineates outcomes, which are the end result of the occupational therapy process. Consistent with the OTPF3, outcomes are summarized into categories that include occupational performance, prevention, health and wellness, quality of life, participation, role competence, well-being, and occupational justice. Examples of each are provided for persons, groups, and populations. Adaptation has also been identified as being embedded in all categories of outcomes. That concludes all of the major sections and summary of updates to the OTPF4. Next, I will turn it over to Julie Dorsey to conclude the presentation.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to all the COP members for their work in putting together this presentation. This highlighted the major changes of the OTPF4, and we hope it gave you a better understanding of how to apply it to your practice. If you're looking for additional continuing education opportunities around the framework, please visit the AOTA online store and check out the CE course, Exploring the OTPF4. This course goes into significant detail on the framework and has interactive learning checkpoints and an application case study included. It's really a great way to learn more about how to use the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework 4th edition to support and advance your practice. Thank you so much for joining us to learn more about the OTPF4. We really appreciate your time. If you have any further questions, please email cop@aota.org. Thank you.